This is the Digital Trust Podcast. In every episode, we strive to bring support to those of you who serve on the front lines and in the trenches of data and technology. We endeavor to bring understanding to the under-resourced and underappreciated, help remove your stress, and provide relief to your pain. Welcome to the Digital Trust Podcast. Sit down with us as we give you hard-hitting advisory conversations to help you build digital trust with your stakeholders and clients, and actionable takeaways to help you become a digitally trustworthy organization.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Digital Trust Podcast. My name is 𝘪𝘨 𝘪𝘵, and this is a special mini holiday episode. Thus, why I'm wearing my cheery Christmas sweater today. And with me today is Bryan Lee. He is co-founder and partner at Privatus. Bryan actually happens to be our first guest on episode 1 and episode 2, if I remember right, on our podcast. So Bryan, welcome back to the show.
Hey, I'm just so happy to be here, 𝘪𝘨. Thanks for having me back. Always a fun time to sit here and talk to you and talk to this audience.
It's definitely my pleasure, Bryan. And what I'm hoping to do today is to take a look back at 2024 and do sort of a year in review as we head into the holidays and kind of unplug for a week or two. So I'm hoping we can hit some topics. And the first one that I have is legislation. Bryan, what was the regulatory scene in 2024 when it comes to data privacy?
Well, we had kind of the expected movement that we thought we were going to get with the EU. And so the big news for 2024 was really some of the things that the EU did, starting the year with something called the EU Data Act. And the big thing about the Data Act for anybody who's doing business in Europe is it essentially lays out this idea that companies in the future need to make it easier for people to share the data that's on a company platform. And so consumers have been advocating this for a long time, and the EU has taken up the charge and has now put it into law. So that's something we can expect to see, and that will have really significant impacts on people's data governance and privacy practices going forward. In the US, we had a couple more states sign on to comprehensive privacy legislation, which is a big deal here. There's been a lot of discussion in the US after the recent election about whether the federal legislation will move forward or not. And there's been some hesitancy to think that that's going to move forward. And so in that vacuum, the states have gone ahead and they've added a couple more to the mix. So if you're doing business in the US from a governance or privacy perspective, 2 more states to add to your pile to check to make sure you're being compliant. I guess up north, we can look at, the big news, 𝘪𝘨 leading the charge once again. They also came up with this kind of data portability guidance, which said that consumers have the right to have their data, take it with them in a portable format. Again, not an easy thing to pull off technically, so something companies need to be aware of. And last but not least, 𝘪𝘨 once again said, hey, guess what? We're finally through all that transition period for Law 25, so it's time to be fully compliant. So if you've been kind of asleep at the switch or forgetting that this was going to happen, Law 25, full effect over September this year.
I appreciate you laying that out, Bryan. What about the enforcement side of regulation? In terms of in Europe, the GDPR, and then particularly in the US and California specifically?
Yeah, that's a good one. So, we know that GDPR is famous for big fines. And so, fortunately for us, we have these gigantic tech companies that you can always look to if you want a story about fines. This year, LinkedIn got a substantial fine, 310 million euros. Really for a good cause, insufficient legal basis for data processing, which sounds very wonkish, but essentially it said, we told consumers we'd use your data for one thing and we started using it for something else without telling you. So pretty straightforward violation of GDPR, and the Europeans came out and hammered them for it. We also had a more technical one, 91 million euros against our favorite company, Meta, for insufficient technical and organizational measures for cybersecurity. So this means not only the kind of technical stuff that we all talk about, the vulnerability monitoring and the encryption and all this kind of thing, but also the workflows and organizational structure behind all that stuff to make sure it's being backed up. So I thought that was really, really interesting. In terms of California, California has been kind of an all bark and no bite for quite a while with its privacy law. This year, it's kind of turned the corner on that. And so its Privacy Protection Agency has just been fully stood up, and they've begun to staff it. And they've come out with several enforcement advisories, principally aiming at the data brokerage area. But they've come out with fines already against some data brokers. And they've also come out with fines against companies who were not as careful as they should be with children's privacy rights. So the big story for that, I guess I can sum it up, Europe is still Europe. They're serious about this stuff. They go after tends to be bigger companies, but they're beginning to be much more observant of the technical and the workflow operations going on in the businesses. And California is trying to pick up, and I think I said when I talked to you about this previously, California is jealous of Europe, right? California is always talking about how wonderful Europe is, and they're getting the same way with privacy. So they're really beginning to clamp down.
You mentioned Meta, Bryan. Let's stay maybe on some big tech topics here. Two that come to mind would be Twitter, or X, and Google. What can you say about what happened this year?
Everyone's favorite big companies. Twitter is interesting, right? Because they've had this kind of ongoing with Elon Musk taking over Twitter. He kind of epitomizes the move fast and break things ethos of Silicon Valley. And people have been very concerned about his privacy practices and data practices. And so he's been engaged in a lot of this kind of back and forth. And the EU has investigated him a couple times. And one of them was under this really legal sounding idea and kind of anti-competitive idea about whether he is subject to the Digital Markets Act, which is essentially saying you gigantic players, you can't shut out the little guys. And so went to Twitter and said, hey, Twitter, we think you're doing that. And Twitter actually made the argument that, we're not really a platform that businesses really use to communicate with their consumers, which kind of flies in the face of the whole advertising idea of Twitter. But Twitter came out and said, no, we're really not for that. We're more kind of people to people. And the EU bought that argument. So I guess the lesson for the rest of us is if you're buying ad space on Twitter, you might want to take your ad dollars someplace else. And speaking of ad dollars, Google is a big thing for ad dollars, of course. And Google has been promising for several years now that they were going to sunset the famous third-party cookie. And the third-party cookie is sort of the godfather of all of our privacy concerns with respect to advertising, right? And this is you visit a web, so you go to Amazon or you say you want to look for sandals, and then you get bombarded with sandal ads on every website you visit after that. That's what the cookie does. Google is aware that that's a privacy concern and has been talking for some time about getting rid of that. And they have a technical solution now that would make advertising much more anonymous and therefore very, very consumer friendly. And of course, companies that advertise hate the idea, and they've been pushing back hard. And looks like right now that they're winning the battle. And Google has announced once again they're going to delay getting rid of those third-party cookies. So that's something we should really watch. It's important for a couple of reasons. It's important for us as consumers. But it's also very, very important for companies that advertise using the kind of cookie ecosystem. Very, very technical solutions coming.
So, Bryan, earlier you mentioned Meta as well for the 91 million euro fine. I believe they also got hit with another 800 million euro fine for anti-competitive behavior of some kind.
Right. That's exactly right. So they got hit for that. And what's interesting about that for us as privacy and data people is the fine essentially said, hey, Meta, you have too much information, right? So Meta was saying, we're going to use our Facebook marketplace and we own all this Facebook data, and we're going to take that social media data and all that profiling and everything that's involved with it and combine it with our marketplace. So we'll have a really awesome marketplace. And the EU said, no, you can't do that. That data that was gathered for Facebook wasn't gathered to sell stuff on marketplace. And besides, in so doing, you have an enormous advantage over regular companies. So that's not competitive. And in order to make sure that you're paying attention, we're going to charge you 800 million euros, which I think even Meta could get even Meta's attention with 800 million euros. So yeah, that's the story behind it.
Pretty huge. Now let's just shift and kind of land the plane here on this mini episode, this holiday episode. Talk about AI. So what's happening with AI in the regulatory space in Europe and then over here in North America?
So the big new Europe has been talking about the so-called EU AI Act, and it's been approved, and it is now the first comprehensive law globally to regulate AI systems. Now, the good news for most of us is we're not building AI systems from scratch. We're not creating high-risk AI systems. So most of the things that they're trying to regulate really only apply to companies like OpenAI or Microsoft or something like that. However, they do consider certain uses of AI to be high risk. And one of those is pretty much anything having to do in the human resource space. So a lot of companies now are using AI or think it's a good idea to, I don't know, read through resumes or help to determine somehow who's going to get promoted based on their evaluations. And the EU specifically highlights that and says that's a no-no. You really can't do that. That comes into a high-risk area. So there's some legislation there, just something to keep in mind. It's going to generate a lot of copyright things, I think. And for most of us, we'll be more the beneficiaries of that than ones who have to action on it. But something that's really important, and a lot of question is, will it end up having as much reverberation as the GDPR did when the GDPR came out? So that's the one thing.
Right.
California, of course, being the epicenter of AI research and epicenter of AI companies, tried to do something similar with this so-called State Bill 1047, which was an effort to regulate safety, which means just making sure that there are some guardrails in place so AI doesn't discriminate against people and these types of things. And interesting, in California, the tech industry was able to squash that. So it didn't really go anywhere, but the fact of the matter is that it raised the question and put that discussion on the table. And to me, it's inevitable that discussion, now that it's out in the open, is going to stay out there. So if you are building something, not being aware of these concerns, or not being aware of those concerns that exist, if you're using AI in your company, you need to just keep one eye on that, because the regulators are paying attention and laws are going to happen that's going to clamp on this. And then I guess for talking about people using AI in companies, Microsoft, which I realize is a company that sells AI, but Microsoft also paid for a study. So maybe there's a little bit of caveat for that. But essentially, Microsoft says 85% of the Fortune 500 are now using generative AI in some way, shape, or form. So I guess the story for the rest of us is, if you haven't got on the bus, now's a good time to get on, because everyone else is doing it.
That's quite a lot to cover. A lot happened in 2024. A very eventful year indeed. Thank you so much, Bryan, for being on the show once again. A special thank you to our viewers and listeners for tuning in on what I assume will be a Christmas and holiday season for you. So I want to say Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, and we will see you in the new year.
Merry Christmas, everyone.
Thanks for joining us today on the Digital Trust Podcast. If you found this conversation helpful, please share it with someone you care about. And if you'd like to receive our monthly newsletter, please click the link in the description to subscribe. And to put your mind at ease, our newsletter will include episode summaries with key points and actionable takeaways, plus a heads up on the upcoming episode guests. Rest assured, it won't be a spammy sales message, and we will never sell or share your information. Thanks again for tuning in, and we will see you on the next episode.